Hey everyone, Wazoo here with Wazoo Web Bytes, and in this episode we're going to be building our very own daily devotional app. Yeah, this is a tutorial aimed at sort of the beginner intermediate stage of using Java Spring Boot and React for our front end, what we see right here. Now, we've got a daily devotional app, but you could extrapolate what we're doing and create basically any app that just displays something on a specific day. So perhaps you want to create a daily recipe blog or a daily inspirational quote. Then this is the kind of system that you can use to put that together. I figure that this is sort of the easiest way to demonstrate the capabilities of what we're going to be building today. And like I said, it's a sort of fits in between the to-do application tutorial that I put together, which I'll put a link in the description down below, and the Spring Boot blog application, which I'll also put in the description down below. So I think this kind of fits right in between. So it's a good spot in between the two. And yeah, I think this is going to be a really interesting tutorial. As you can see, we've got a title for our application. I just called it Daily Devotional. And we've got some kind of image that you want to put there, along with today's date, which is the April 25th, 2023, as of this recording. And then we've got the ability to display a quote, which we've got right here. And then we've got space underneath for an extra blurb underneath. So usually in a devotional, there's sort of a quote of scripture, and then underneath there's sort of a lesson or some kind of story that usually goes along with a quote for the day. So this is going to be done, as I said, with Java Spring Boot, and we'll be using React for the front end. And instead of using Create React App, we will be using a little bundler called Vite.js. It's sort of a rising star, at least as of today. It's a rising star sort of in that bundler space. The last news I got on the Create React App sort of generator from the React team, is that they were looking to deprecate it. So I don't know what their timeline is on that, but it is a really easy tool. Using Vite is a really easy tool to spin up your own React front end with the bare configuration that you need to get going, and everything just sort of works. Very similar to the Create React App approach, where you have everything kind of set up and pre-configured to handle CSS, JavaScript, and the like. So you get a similar piece of functionality with the Vite.js bundler, only it's a little more lightweight, but it's still essentially at the end of the day functions the same as the Create React App sort of skeleton template generator. Okay, with that aside, let's get into this application. Okay, so here we are at start.spring.io, which is the destination for creating your own Spring Boot project. It's an easy generator that puts together all the essentials that you need to get going in your Spring Boot application. So we're going to be using a Maven project. We'll stick to the Java language. We'll be using the latest version, which is 3.0.6 as of this recording. And we'll just change our artifact name to Spring Boot 3 Daily Devotional. And you can leave the rest the same, change it to whatever name you want. And we'll be using a jar file, and we'll just leave this on Java 17. I think that's sufficient for what we're doing. And then over here on the dependencies, we're just going to be adding the dev tools, Lombok, and then Spring Web, and H2 database, and Spring Data. And that is going to be it. So once you're happy with what you've got set up in this generator, go ahead and hit the generate button, download the zip file, and open it in your favorite IDE. Okay, so here we are in IntelliJ. I've gone ahead and extracted and opened up the project, and I've got it open in the editor here. So as you can see, it looks like the usual Spring Boot application that is generated. What we're going to do is open up the source main resources application.properties file, and we're going to go ahead and just set up some basic database properties that we can use, which I pretty much keep the same in just about all of my Spring Boot tutorials. Okay, so let's go through these line by line. So server port, we're just keeping that at port 8080. It's the default port that Spring Boot listens on, but I like to set it here explicitly just to help myself out whenever I come back to this project, maybe a few weeks or months from now. I've also set up some basic database properties here for our local H2 database. So we're going to be creating a /data/demo database with the username of admin and password, which will come important later on when we open this up in the H2 console, which is the web interface for looking at the local database. So we're going to be setting up some additional flags here for the H2 console. You can just cut and paste these as is. We're enabling it, we're setting it to true, and here's the path that we need to use in the browser. And we've got some additional Hibernate settings here, which we don't really need to worry about until later on. So you can just keep these in here for now, and we'll go through them later on when we get to working more with the database. Okay, so with all that set up, go ahead and start up the server and just make sure, that always comes up the first time you start. Just make sure that everything starts up okay. This font size is rather massive. Hopefully it's easier to read when you're following this on video. Okay, so we've got our Tomcat port started up on 8080. And let's go ahead and open it up in our browser, and we'll be expecting to see the familiar white label error page. And there we go. That's exactly the error page we're looking for, and so far so good. Okay, so what we are going to be doing is we are going to be, you can go ahead and stop the application for now, and let's get that out of the way so we can make this a little bit easier to read. So what we're going to do is we are going to set up our backend. So basically we're going to be storing our daily, I'm calling them daily devotionals, but your daily items, whatever they may be. So what I'm going to be doing is creating a API service through Spring Boot, which will help with deciding which daily devotional to be passing forward to the front end whenever it's being requested from our React side. So we're first going to set up in our source main Java folder in the com.example.springboot3 daily devotional main folder. We're going to be setting up a few folders. Hopefully this is legible to read. So we're going to be setting up one called models, and we're going to be setting up one called repositories. And we're going to be setting up one called controllers. And finally, one more called services. Okay, so we've got these 4 folders set up. So we're first going to start off with our devotional model. So in the models folder, go ahead and just create a new class and just call it devotional. Okay, so we've got a basic class here set up. And so all we need to do is, with the help of Lombok, we just need to declare this class, declare this model, as an entity. And we're working with data so that the automatic getter and setter functions are created by Lombok. And then we're also going to need a noargs constructor. and an all-args constructor. We'll be making use of those annotations from Lombok. Okay, so very similar to what we did in the to-do application, we're going to be creating a ID field, which is a generated value. And we're going to be using oh boy, all these hovers get in the way. We're going to be using a strategy of generation type sequence. Okay, and then this will just be our ID field. So we'll give it a long ID. Okay, and then we're going to have a quote area. So let's just call this, we'll store that as a string. And then we're going to have some kind of author. So we'll be using a string for that as well. And then we will be storing the path to our image. So that'll be another string. And I just called it, image path. Okay, and then what I want to do is the actual content. So we are going to be using the column annotation and using column definition equals text to just basically let Hibernate and Spring Boot know that this is going to be more or less sort of a blob of text. So I'm picturing that this field will be something like 5,000 characters long in the database. We're going to have a few datetime fields here. So we're going to have a local datetime field, which is our created at timestamp. We're going to have a local datetime field of our updated at timestamp. And then I created a new one, or I created an additional one called local date, which is just going to store the year, month, and day, which will represent the day that we want to display in our app whenever we come to it. So this is the published at date is pretty much the date that we want to display our daily item. And then I've also got a toString method here, which just converts our model object into a string, which helps when we're looking at it in our log file. So instead of typing this all out, go ahead and cut and paste this and just make it easy on yourself. Okay, so we've got our model set up. We've got everything constructed there. So we're going to go ahead and create a repository, which is a interface between our model and the local database. So let's go ahead and we'll create a new Java class, only we'll call it an interface. We'll call this interface Devotional Repository. Okay, so we're going to be extending the JPA repository interface. Tory. And we'll use our model name of devotional and then the long to identify the ID element of our model, basically, of our item. Okay, and we're going to create another interface method within here. So we're going to be, we're going to be returning an optional object because this devotional may or may not exist in the database. And what we want to do is we want to find by published at. So we want to find a record given a published at local date object. Okay, so when we're dealing with our repository, we can expose this method find by published at, and then when we pass in a date, a local date, it will then query the database and hopefully return a matching devotional. Okay, so next we are going to be looking at a service to handle all this. So a service usually comes in as the glue between the web controller, the REST controller that we're going to be building to listen for our API calls, and our repository. So it's sort of very similar to how a repository is a is the glue layer between working with the database and the model. A service is that glue layer between working with the repository and a controller. So in the services package, let's go ahead and create a new Java class, and we'll just call it Devotional Service. Cool. And we'll give it the service annotation. And as well as the allargs constructor annotation. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're just going to declare a field, so private final devotional repository. And by using the private final way of declaring this, the allargs constructor will automatically pass in the repository to this service for us. So it's pretty similar to using the auto-wired annotation, only this does make it easier to help with testing later on. Okay, so first what we're going to do is we are going to create a getDaily method. So we're going to be returning a optional of our devotional model, and then we'll just call this getDaily. And we'll need to pass in, or we won't be passing anything into this. Okay, so we're going to be creating a local date object of today. So local date.now, which gets today's date. And then we're going to be returning a devotional repository find by published at date. So we're going to pass in the date of today into the repository method. So if everything looks good, it'll then return it from this getDaily method. Okay, and then we're gonna create a getAll. So we're gonna return a list of devotionals, and we'll just call this method getAllDailies, or getAllDevotions, sorry. And we are going to return devotional repository find all. So it's basically just a helper method to return everything in the database. Okay, and then the last method that we're going to expose in our service is some way to create a new devotional. So we're going to be returning a devotional. So we'll call this method public, and then save, and we'll be passing in a incomplete devotional. We'll save it and then return the same thing back to the caller object. Okay, so if the given devotional has no ID, then it means it's a brand new one. So if getID equals null, then what we want to do is we want to set the created at date, or the created at timestamp field, to local date time now. Okay, and then what we want to do is then set the updated at field with the same kind of call, local date time now. And then what we want to do is we want to return the devotional repository save devotional. So we're just passing in the given devotional. Whoops. It would help if I spelled that correctly. So we're just passing in the given devotional. Here, let's move this over a little bit. We're just passing in the given devotional object. And so we're checking the ID to see if it's null. If it is, then it means we're working with a brand new devotional object. So let's go ahead and generate a new date timestamp for the created at field. And then we'll keep going in this method. We'll set the updated at timestamp field to be the current local date time. And then we'll return the object once it's saved into the repository. And that's about all we need, just those three methods. Yeah. So now what we'll do is we'll go and create a controller for it, a controller for this. so that we can interface with it from our web service, or we'll create a web service that'll interface with this to our React front end. So in the controllers package here, let's create a new Java class and we'll call it Devotional Controller. Devotional Controller, okay. And then what we're going to do is we're going to be making use of the REST controller annotation. And then we're going to be starting things off with a request mapping of /API v1. Okay. And then we're going to be using the allargs constructor again from Lombok. Okay. And then the only member that we have, or the only member item that we have in our controller is a handle to our devotional service. Whoops. Devotional service. Devotional service. If I could spell, that would be great. All right. Let's create a way to retrieve all of the devotional items in the database, so through the service. So we're going to be calling this, we're going to be using the get mapping annotation, and we'll be using /devotionals. So that way, when you use /API/v1/devotionals, then Java Spring Boot will automatically find this function and then go through and return all of the devotionals that are in our through the service. So let's use a public, and we're going to be creating something called a response entity. And let's just call this method get all devotionals. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're first going to have a list of devotionals. We'll call it devotionals. And we'll get all of them from the service. So get all devotions. Okay. And let's just move this over here so we can see a little bit more. And then what we're going to do is we're going to create a map object, and this will make it easier for Spring Boot to generate JSON for us that we'll be reading from the React front end. So we'll create a map here of string and object. Map equals new hash map. Okay, so string map string object map equals new hash map. And then what we're going to do is we're going to create a field in there called status. And we'll just say 200. Basically, everything went okay. And we are going to put another field in there called data. And that's where we'll store the list of devotionals. And then we are going to return a new response entity. And we'll return that map object along with HTTP status OK. All right, so all we're going to do here is we've got a get mapping. So whenever we make a browser request to /devotionals, or a request from our JavaScript front end to /API/v1/devotionals, then we're going to be entering this method here. We're going to be using the devotional service to get all of the devotions, storing them in a list, and then we're going to create a new hash map object and then assign the list of devotionals into this hash map, and then finally return it back to the front end, which automatically will be converted into JSON so that we can use it easily from JavaScript. Okay, so we're going to create a similar get mapping, and we're going to be calling this one devotionals/daily. So when we want just the current day, we don't want a list of all of them, we just want the single one. So let's call this method, public response entity is what we want to return. And we use the question mark in here. I didn't explain it before, but we use the question mark to basically, it's used as a wildcard in this scenario. So we might fail, the operation that we're doing inside here might fail. So we might have to create a different kind of response entity. In some more advanced Spring Boot applications, you might want to put in some actual error objects. Okay, So we now have, we're going to declare an optional of devotional, and devotional equals, and we're going to use the devotional service, and we're just going to get the daily for today. Okay, and then again, we're going to create a new hash map of string and object equals new hash map. Okay, so now if the devotional is empty, so it means that there's nothing for today, so it's some kind of error, we want to put a status of 404. So we didn't find, 404 is usually the status code used for a resource that we don't find in our database. So we're not finding the current devotional for today. So let's assign a status of 404, and let's put null for our data. That will be read by the front end. Okay, so otherwise, let's put a status of 200, which is usually the status code is used on the web for something that succeeds. So status code of 200, and we are going to assign the data attribute to our devotional get, because we're working with an optional object. So the optional object is sort of a wrapper around what we've returned from the service. So the wrapper could have nothing inside, which is what will happen if isEmpty is true, or it'll have the actual object that we're trying to retrieve, which is our devotional. Okay, and then finally, same thing as what we did in the previous function. We want to return a new response entity, and we'll use map and then HTTP status OK. Perfect. So that's all we need in our controller, in our web controller, to get started. So what we're going to do now is we are going to switch gears and start working on our front end. Okay, so here we are in the folder. I'm on a command prompt. And as you can see, I'm in the actual folder where this project is. So if I do an ls, then you'll see that we've got our data folder set up, our pom.xml, and our source and target folders. Let's see if I can make this a little bit bigger. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to go into the source main folder, so cd source main. And what we want to do at this level is we want to create our front end folder. So what we're going to need to do first is globally install the Vite.js bundler. And it actually creates a little project for us. So with npm installed on your system, all you have to do is type in npm create vite at latest. And it'll run out and do this thing, and it'll ask you, okay, to install this create Vite package. Hit yes, and it'll do its thing. And so for project name, we're just going to call this front end. And we're going to be choosing the React framework and then JavaScript. Okay, perfect. So all we have to do is enter the front end folder and then npm install to make sure that we get all of the dependencies that we need for React. So once that finishes, all we have to do is type in npm run dev, and it will start up the local service. And so then if we go to that port, HTTP localhost 5173, okay, you'll see that we have a basic Vite plus React page with the spinning React logo and our little Vite logo here. And it's by default, this comes with the project. And so it's got a button that we can click, and it maintains the state of the amount of clicks on the buttons that we've done, which then updates the label of the button here. So we can go ahead and keep this running. And let's go back into our editor and open this up. Okay, so we've got a front end folder. Let's just quickly look at it right now. And I guess we can't close these other ones. Okay, so we've got our basic package.json, which is similar to the pom.xml file from a Spring Boot project. And if we open this up, then this contains all of the dependencies that we're using in our JavaScript project. And so we've given this the name of front end. We can call it whatever we want here. And these are the scripts that we can use when wanting to work with our application. So really, the only two that we're going to need to use use most often is build and dev. So when we typed in npm run dev, it launched this dev script, which once it finds the dev key, it will then match it to the script it's supposed to run, which in this case is just calling Vite, which will take care of processing and bundling our JavaScript and launching that dev web server for us. And the other one is build. So when we use npm run build, then what that's doing is it's using Vite to build our application. So basically packaging it up for whenever we want to, let's say, put it together in our Spring Boot project for deployment on the cloud. And so far, we've just got the React and React DOM dependencies, and then a few dev ones that we don't really care about right now. So then we've also got a starter index HTML file, which is what some of the markup we saw in our project, or in the default template right here. And in the source folder is where all of our JavaScript and CSS is. So by default, we've got an app component, which, as we see, it contains the Vite.js logo, the React logo, and it's got a button here with a built-in function where if React detects that we've clicked the button, then it will increase this count variable and then display the count variable on the button label. So we can leave all of this together. We don't need to touch any of this. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a new file, and we're just going to call it AppRoot. So new component. So what we're going to do in the source folder is we're going to create a new component here, a new file, and we'll just call it AppRoot. So AppRoot.jsx. And then we've got a blank file here so far. So what we're going to do is we're going to be importing useEffect and useState from React. And so then we've got a AppRoot component. And we'll need to export it. So at the bottom of the file here is usually where I put the export statements. So export default AppRoot. Okay, and then every component in React needs to have a return function, which is what returns the actual markup. So let's create a return. Oops. And we can use these empty tags to basically create our own, to wrap whatever HTML we want to return from this function. Okay, so first we're going to return a div, and then, oops. Let's see, what can we do first? So first, we are going to return a div, and but before we do that, we are going to create a variable to contain the data that we want to restore. We're going to create a variable that we want to use to store what the daily devotional that we get from our service, so from the web service of the Spring Boot side. So we can use the useState hook from React for that. So if we declare an array and we have two elements in this array, so data and then set data, and then equals useState. And then within the useState hook, we can specify a default, so sort of an initial state of data, and it'll just be an empty object. And then what we want to do is we want to, every time that we load this page, what we want to do is make a request to the backend to retrieve that daily devotional. So what we'll use in the React world is something called useEffect. So useEffect is another hook, which basically is a trigger, like an event trigger. And we use the arrow function for this, which is just some fancy JavaScript for using this. Okay, so we've got a function that useEffect will trigger, and we're going to be using the fetch API from JavaScript, and we're just going to be using /API/v1/devotionals/daily, which is what we set up in the web service. And so the fetch call returns what's called a promise. So every promise in JavaScript works sort of like some kind of object that will or will not complete sometime in the future, for lack of a better explanation. Don't worry too much. As you get used to using them, it'll sort of make sense. So the response that we get back for it, all we have to do is convert that to JSON using the JSON function. And then with that JSON data, all we want to do is call set data. Okay, so set data, our JSON, and then the data field. Remember, if you recall from let's go back to the service. If you recall from our controller, we're putting things into a JSON property called data. So that's what we'll need to parse when we get it from our web service. So we're returning the JSON, we're using the data field, and then we're saving it into our data state variable up here. And the second parameter of useEffect is how often or when do you want this useEffect to trigger? And we only need it when we start up. So if you use an empty array, then that means that it's a sort of a special annotation here for useEffect, where every time useEffect starts up, it will then only once trigger this whatever code we have inside. So just to make sure that the useEffect is triggering, we can put a console log here and just call it useEffect startup. Anything you want to display in the log, we'll just put it in here. Okay, so let's start with that. Our server is still running, so let's go ahead and go back to our browser. And let's open up the DevTools. Oh yeah, we didn't update our, okay, silly me. So we've created a new component called AppRoot, but our index is still referencing the app component. So just to fix that up, let's import AppRoot from /approot.jsx. And then we're going to be returning AppRoot as our main application, or as our main component of our application. So let's go back to the browser window here. Okay, so nothing is happening, nothing correct is happening with that fetch API call, because I don't think we've got the server running, and we're not properly handling the service call just yet. Okay, so we've got our useEffect startup, which you can see in the log. So that part is all working okay. So let's go ahead and start our Spring Boot server. So we'll have that up and running in the background. We can now leave the Spring Boot server always running in the background, because I think we've got everything set up correctly there. Okay. So what we need to do, let's just go back to our server for a little short while, what we've done is we've set everything up, but because of the way we've set up our application properties, so in our application properties here, what we're telling it to do is we want to seed our database with some seed data that we want to put into this application. Now, in some of the other tutorials that I've gone through, we've created an object called seed data within the project itself, and then during startup, it runs through this object and generates some entities in the database for us. So instead of doing it that way this time, I'm going to show you how to use actual SQL, so that if you've got your own SQL statements, then instead of maintaining a object to handle pre-populating your database, you can use direct SQL. So within the resources folder, let's go ahead and create two SQL files. We'll call one of them data.sql and the other one schema.xml, or not, schema.sql. So the schema file, so in our schema, what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to create our table, our devotional table, and we're going to want to create the sequence, the ID sequence that we need to use for our project. So right at the top, we're going to be using the SQL create table devotional. Okay, and then our first field is an integer called ID. It's not null, and we'll use the auto increment parameter for it, or descriptor for it. Then our next field is called quote, which is a varchar, and I've just given it a length of 255. And we've also got the author field, which is another varchar of 255. And then we've got a image path, which is a varchar 255. And then our content, remember that was sort of the special property of our model with a text column definition. So we're going to be declaring a varchar of 5,000. Why not? And then we've got a created at field, which is a timestamp, and an updated at field, which is another timestamp, or column, I should say, not field, column, published at column, which is a normal date. And then we're going to declare our primary key to be that ID column. And then make sure to end the SQL with a semicolon. And then let's go on and create a sequence. So we want to create a sequence, devotional SEQ. And then what we want to do is we want to start with 50, increment by 50. Our min value is 50, and our max value is, I just used 9999. You can make this whatever you want, within reason, of course. And no cycle, so the no cycle parameter at the end means that when you reach the maximum value, then we just throw an error whenever we want to save a new devotional, or when we want to use the next item in the sequence, then it'll return an error if we reach this max value. Otherwise, if we use a cycle right here, then what it'll do is once it reaches the max value, it'll loop around and start things off at the min value, which very dangerous, at least in my head. Okay, so we've got this going. Now, one thing we want to make sure that we do is every time in our application properties, since we've got this spring.sql.init mode equals always flag set, then that means every single time we start up the server, it's going to run through the schema setup, which will attempt to create a table. So since we're not destroying the table when we shut down the server, what we need to do here is put in some smarts to have it detect that, okay, The devotional table already exists, so we don't need to try to create it again. So all we need to do is use create table if not exists. So if the devotional table doesn't exist, then create it. And similarly with the devotional sequence. So create sequence if not exists, and booyah. So we've got our schema there. So now let's actually put in some starter SQL data. And all we need to do is create one. Let's just drop one in there. So I'm going to cut and paste what I've got. So I'm going to insert into the devotional table. Okay, so forget this red highlighting. I know it looks scary, but I think it's just a setting within IntelliJ that I'm not setting for this video right now. So all we're doing right now is we're in the data.sql file, which is where we have the actual calls to populating our tables. So I've got a insert into the devotional table, and I've got our fields, our columns of ID, quote, author, content, created at, updated at, and published at. And then we've got a select statement. And then this is the ID that we want to pre-populate, which is a 1. And then our quote, and then our author. Let's just move down here. Okay, and then so we've got timestamps for the created at and updated at, and then the current date, which is whenever we run this for the first time, as the seed item. So this where clause here, so where not exists, and then we create what's called a subquery, which we're selecting ID from devotional where ID is equal to 1. So this entire thing, since like what I was saying in our schema setup, since this SQL is executed whenever we start up our server, then this means that we only want to insert the seed data once. We don't want to keep like adding to it every single time that we start up the server. So structuring our query this way will only insert this new record, this new seed record, if the ID does not exist in the database. Okay, so let's go ahead and start up this server. So now we should be able to start this without a hitch. Okay, everything looks all right. Okay, so we started the Spring Boot application listening on port 8080. And let's just verify that the seed data got in there. So let's go through the actual H2 console. So if we go to our web browser and type in http localhost 8080/H2 console, we get our login screen for our H2 console application. So remember, our username was admin and the password was just password. And this JDBC URL is copied directly from the application properties file. So this line right here. So let's go ahead and hit connect. And you can see that we've got our table and we've got our sequence. Okay, so that looks good. That looks promising at any rate. So if we expand this, then we can see that we've got our ID, quote, author, image path, content, and basically all of our columns that we wanted. And then if we click on it, it'll automatically generate this select star from devotional. If we hit the run button, it will then display what's coming back from the database. And as you can see, we've got our record that we just inserted from that data SQL file. Okay, so everything looks fantastic so far in the server. It's all coming together. We can leave this here. We can leave the server up and running, and we can leave the JavaScript up and running. So let's get back to that now. So we've got, if you recall, we've got our, let's go to our different tab here for our application. So our Vite builder, the dev mode builder, is listening on port 5173. And so if we refresh it, now we're still seeing that error coming up. So okay, good. We can expand that a bit. So let's go into the network tab and let's go down to our call. And we've got our request here, which is not completing correctly. So it's if you can see, okay, hopefully I can show this right. Okay, so we've got a status code of okay. So we're trying to make this request. So /API devotionals daily. But as you can see, our request URL is mapping to port 5173 instead of the server, which is port 8080. So what's happening there? So since we are using /API, we don't right here in this fetch call. So what we don't want to do is we don't want to put in our server here. So HTTP localhost 8080. And the reason for that is that if we ever change the server path, the server port that our Spring Boot server is listening on, then we will have to, instead of just being able to run this code wherever we want to put it, we'll have to then go back in here and update this call to change this address here. So what we want to do is leave this as /API, and we want to set up something called a proxy in the Vite bundler. So whenever we have a /API, the Vite will resolve this /API to a proxy that we'll set up, which will be configured to talk to the local server. So let's, in the Vite, there's a Vite config.js file, which is automatically put there by the Vite creation tool that we went through. And right now, all it has is it's got a plugins and then React. So basically initialize the React plugins. So what we want to do is we want to create a new configuration property called server. And then within that, we want to create something called proxy. And then we'll create one called /API. So everything that starts with /API, we want to use a target of HTTP localhost 8080 as the domain. So we want to change the origin, set that to true, and it's not a secure endpoint. We're not using HTTPS, so we'll just use secure false. And that is it. So let's just, yep, we've got everything configured here. And then if we go back to our browser, we've still got that front end, we've still got Vite running, and it'll pick up the changes and restart itself. So let's go back here and refresh the page. So we've made the call. You can see here that our request URL is still to port 5173, but this time when we look at the response tab, you can see that it's the actual JSON that we're expecting from our backend. So the Vite bundler is taking that location request, that request URL, and then remapping it with the help of that proxy config to talk to the Spring Boot backend. And so this way, the one point I forgot to mention when going through that explanation is that this way, when you bundle this up, and this won't be used, that this server proxy configuration won't be used when we are bundling this package to deploy to production. So when we're using Vite build to bundle up this JavaScript and package it into Spring Boot, then when that application is running and it uses the /API call, then this, since it's running on the same host as the server, then it will automatically have the correct domain in front of it, and it'll be able to find the /API in the backend hosted by Spring Boot. Hopefully that makes sense. So back to our component. Okay, so we've got our data coming in. So what we want to do is we want to now actually display it. So let's go ahead and we'll create let's create an H1 to display our daily devotional, our daily devotional title. And then I'm using a HR element, horizontal rule, HTML element. Okay. And then what we're going to do is we are going to create another div. So we've got a div section, which is where we want to display our actual content here. So what I want to do is I want to put this inside a list. So a UL, an unordered list. Okay, and then so the first element is going to be that image. So I'm going to use the image, the HTML image, and then what I want to use is the source, and then we're going to be using the data/image path. So since our data object, which is what we set up here, which is what is the actual object we're getting back from our web service call, it's going to be stored into this data object. So all we have to do to reference it is data dot and then the property name that we want to work with. So then what I want to do is display the publish date. So let's just call this data published at. And so these squiggly brackets is the React syntax for working with the data variable that we've got. Okay, and then we've got our quote. So we want to display our quote. So let's go ahead and create another li element. And then we'll be using a p tag, and then just, data.quote. Perfect. And then we'll display the author somewhere too. Maybe we'll put that in last. And then finally we'll display the actual content. So data/content, or .content, not slash. And then after this UL element, let's create another horizontal rule. And hopefully I've got everything together there. And let's go back and refresh the page. Okay, so we've got our daily devotional. We've got a image reference here, which is broken, of course, because we don't have any images yet. But it's resolving to images/1.jpg. And then we've got our published at date of 2023/04/25, which is today. So it'll be whenever day you start this up, start your own server up. And then we've got our quote that we've got here, and then our content, which is our basically lorem ipsum text. Okay, so everything is looking good. We've got a really weird layout. And so one thing we can do, which is what I did in my demo app there, is I pulled in Bootstrap, which is basically some CSS, a CSS framework to help us style our application in a quick manner. So all we have to do is let's stop the server, stop the JavaScript bundler, Control C, and then let's just type in npm install bootstrap and then save, -- save. So it will go ahead and it will install the Bootstrap library. And then all we need to do is import it. So all we have to do in our main.jsx file, let's get that open over here, main.jsx, right before our import.index.css file, let's go ahead and import the Bootstrap CSS. So that we can find that in the bootstrap/dist/css/bootstrap.min.css. So we've got that import statement here. And let's go ahead and in the index.css, let's just delete all this. Okay, we don't need any of that. And what we're going to do is we're going to put in some other CSS that I just put together for this application. So we're going to restyle the UL to basically hide the dots for the list, for each list item. And then I've got a class called content date, which is what we're going to be using to display that publish date. And then we've got a class called content, which is what we're going to be using to display that content. So back in our AppRoot.jsx file, let's go ahead and add in some of the Bootstrap classes. We'll be using a class name of text center and display 1. Okay, div. And then we've got another class name here. And all this is doing is we're making use of the grid elements of the Bootstrap CSS. So we want to separate our elements into its own sort of row. One row will be for the image, and then one row will be for the header, and then we'll separate out the rest of the elements. Okay, so we've got our Bootstrap class styles added to the markup here, so you can go through it and go through the project, the zip file that accompanies this video, and you can take a look at the elements and class names that we've given each one. And so if you go back and refresh our front end, once you restart the server, so npm run dev, sorry, I forgot about that. Okay, so you get our styles all set up, and then all I did is copied some images that I found, copyright-free images that I found online. I put them into the public folder /images. Okay, so there we go. So I've copied in some images that I found online, copyright-free, and then I just dropped them into the project, into the public folder, which is where we can put our static assets for our React application, and just drop them in there. And just drop them in there. So go ahead and take a look at that with the zip file that you get. And that about wraps it up for our React front end. That's all we really need to do here. We don't need to do anything more than that. So what we're going to do is then, go back to our Spring Boot server and look at testing. Okay, so if you look at test in Spring Boot, by default, Spring Boot comes with its own JUnit testing suite. And it has one module already set up to handle tests. So if you look in the test folder under Java, example, Spring Boot 3 Daily Devotional, and then Spring Boot 3 Daily Devotional Test, we've got an empty test here with the @Spring Boot test annotation, along with some green arrows because that's how it shows up in IntelliJ. So for an easy way to run this, all we have to do is click the test that we want to test. Click the arrow next to the test we want to test. So if we want to click this test here, we can just click the green arrow, and Spring Boot will take care of setting everything up. And let's go ahead and see the output. The test output, at any rate, we should see a green check mark here for context load. So there we go. We've got a green check mark. So this is just an easy way to make sure that the basic test works. Like the basic libraries are all set up correctly. Okay, so let's go ahead and create our own test. And all I'm going to do is write some tests for that devotional service. So let's create a new class in the root of that folder, and we'll just call it Devotional Service Test. Okay, and then all we have to do is use the Spring Boot test annotation. Okay, and that'll pull in what we need to, and then we just need to pull in the devotional service and the repository. So I'm using AutoWired to pull those in. So we've got our handle to our service and then a handle to the repository, because there's a few tests where we have to manipulate the database directly. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a test for finding a specific devotional given its ID. Okay, so let's use the annotation test, and then we'll use the display name annotation, and here we can just give this an English text description. So find a given devotional by its ID. Okay, so void find a devotional by ID. Okay, and then so all we have to do is we have to create a empty devotional. Let's just we can just set one property. So we'll just set the quote to be foo. And then what we'll do is we'll save it. So devo equals service dot save devo. So then if the service completes correctly, it will then return the created object back into the devo property. And then here is where we create a optional of the devotional model. We want to call it test item. And then what we want to do is use the repository interface and then find by a given ID. So find by ID of devo get ID. And then we want to make sure, we want to assert that this is true. We want to assert that this object exists. So assert equals. So our test item is present, is actually true. Okay. And then we also want to assert that the test item ID is equal to our devo get ID. Okay, so let's just resolve those methods there. Okay, so we've got a test. So basically we're creating a new devotional, we're setting it with a quote, we're saving it to the database, we're persisting it, and we're returning the persisted object. So it means that we'll have a valid ID coming back from the service. And then we're going to be using the repository interface to find it using the same ID that we had coming back. And then we just have two tests here to actually prove that it came back correctly. So now if we click the green arrow next to the test and select run, then what we should do is see it showing up in our list. Okay, so that worked. So we've got a green check mark beside find a given devotional by its ID. Okay, so that should work anyway. It's sort of a weird test to write, but I was just writing it to demonstrate the basics of putting a test together. So let's create one which finds the devotional for today. So we're testing that the get daily method of the service. So that might be a valid test to write. So again, let's use the test annotation, and we're going to create a display name of finding today's devotional succeeds. Okay, and we'll just create a small function here, get today's daily devotional succeeds. Okay, so what we're going to do again is we're going to create a dummy devotional item, and we're just going to set the content to be foo. And then we're going to create a local date timestamp. So today equals local date dot now. And then we're going to set the published at date to be that now. Okay. And then we'll use that same item equals service.save item. Okay, so we've got this persisted in the database. So now we want to test that get daily call. So we've got an optional devotional, and we'll just call this test item equals service get daily. And then we want to assert that the test item is present is equal to true. And then we want to assert that the test item ID is the given ID, so get ID. And then we want to assert equals that the test item get published at is equal to item get published at. The internal repository interface call pretty much validates this test already, because otherwise it'll work or it won't. It'll either return something or it won't, but it might be just a good property to just assert while we're writing this test. So let's go ahead and click the green button next to the test, and we'll open up the console here and just make sure that everything passes correctly. And hooray, we've got a green check mark next to the test. Finding today's devotional succeeds. All right. So that's about all I had for the tutorial today for putting things together. I want to thank you for making it this far through this video. I hope you found this really informative and helped you work through this project. Like I said, you don't have to write your own daily devotional app. This could be something like a daily recipe or daily inspirational quote, whatever you want to put together. I leave it into your hands. So you can go through the code that comes through with this tutorial. The link will be in the description down below. And if you found this tutorial useful for you, please give it a like, subscribe to the channel for notifications on future content that I put together. And just leave a comment down below if this helped you, if it didn't help you, if there's a section that I went through too quickly or didn't spend enough time in. Well, I guess that's the same thing. Or there was another another topic that I didn't discuss at all that you wished I went through as part of this walkthrough. So yeah, I'm looking forward to putting the next one together for you, and I'll see you next time. Thanks, everyone. Peace.